Der 12. September 1944. Fort Saint-Quentin, Metz, France. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter raised his field glasses and studied the American column emerging from the tree line, 3,200 meters to the west. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Moselle valley, and through the crystalline air he could clearly identify the distinctive silhouettes, Sherman tanks, at least a company strength, perhaps 15 vehicles, spreading into combat formation along the ridgeline opposite his position. Richter lowered the glasses and permitted himself a thin smile. The Americans were making the same mistake they had made at every fortified position from Normandy to here. They believed their numerical superiority and industrial production would overcome German defensive engineering. They would learn, as their predecessors had learned at terrible cost. Fort Saint-Quentin represented 19th-century French military architecture perfected by German defensive doctrine. The main bunker, where Richter stood, featured reinforced concrete walls 2.5 meters thick, designed to withstand sustained bombardment by heavy artillery. The fort's 5 interconnected bunkers provided interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. The Americans would have to advance across 3,000 meters of open ground, through pre-registered mortar and artillery zones, under fire from hull-down positions that no tank gun could effectively engage at this range. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics were simple and had been proven repeatedly. The American M4 Sherman mounted a 75mm M3 gun with an effective range against bunkers of perhaps 600 to 800 meters. At that distance, Richter's 3 PaK-40 anti-tank guns and 2 carefully concealed Panther tanks in prepared positions would devastate the American armor. The Shermans would burn long before they reached effective firing range. Herr Oberleutnant, Unteroffizier Hartmann called from the observation slit. The Americans are not advancing, they're positioning along the ridgeline. Richter returned to his observation position. Through the glasses, he watched the Shermans settling into hull-down positions behind the distant ridge. Their commanders were visible in the turrets, exposed from the chest up, unconcerned about the range. Several appeared to be consulting maps and pointing toward the fort complex. They're preparing for an artillery barrage before the advance, Richter announced to his crew. Standard American doctrine. They'll waste ammunition for 30 minutes, then advance expecting to find us stunned. When they reach 800 meters, we'll demonstrate why the Wehrmacht still holds Metz. The Germans had studied American tactical doctrine extensively. The pattern was predictable. Heavy artillery preparation, infantry and armor advance under covering fire, overwhelming application of firepower to compensate for tactical finesse. The Americans fought like their factories produced with volume rather than precision. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, distinct from artillery. Richter's trained ear recognized it immediately. A tank gun, but with a deeper, heavier report than the usual 75mm. He raised his glasses toward the American position. The observation post to Richter's left, a smaller bunker housing forward observers and communications equipment, erupted in a fountain of concrete, steel, and earth. The explosion's violence stunned him. This was not the secondary detonation of a 75mm armor-piercing round glancing off concrete. This was a direct hit by a high-explosive shell carrying substantial charge. The concussion wave hit Richter's bunker 3 seconds later, rattling equipment and coating everyone inside with dust from the ceiling. Before he could process what had occurred, before he could even begin calculating what weapon could have reached across 3,200 meters and demolished a hardened position, the second shot struck. The bunker shuddered as if struck by earthquake. Richter was thrown against the concrete wall. His ears rang from the overpressure. Through the observation slit, now partially obscured by smoke and debris, he saw where the shell had impacted directly on the glacis of Bunker 3, the main anti-tank position. A third shot, then a fourth. The Americans were firing systematically, one gun after another in a deliberate, unhurried pattern. Each shell found its target with artillery-like precision, but these were not towed guns firing from distant positions. These were the tanks he had dismissed as ineffective at this range. "Impossible," Richter whispered, his training and experience rejecting what his eyes witnessed. "Tank guns cannot reach this far, cannot be accurate at this range." Hartmann, blood streaming from his nose where he had struck the observation rail, pointed with a shaking hand toward the American ridgeline. "Herr Oberleutnant, they're not moving. They're firing from static positions, like artillery." Another shell struck Bunker 5, penetrating the vision slit and detonating inside. Richter watched in horror as smoke and flame vented from every opening. The men inside, 7 soldiers he had shared breakfast with this morning, were gone, erased by a weapon that should not exist, firing from a range that should not be possible. The pattern of fire was methodical, professional, devastating. The Americans were not firing in the rapid, volume-focused manner Richter had been trained to expect. Each shot was deliberate, carefully aimed, with 10 to 15 seconds between impacts. Forward observers were clearly calling corrections. The American tankers were employing indirect fire techniques, using their vehicles as self-propelled howitzers, while protected by armor and positioned beyond the effective range of German anti-tank weapons. "All guns, return fire!" Richter shouted into the radio, his voice cracking. "Pack guns, engage the American armor." The 2 surviving Pack 42nds opened fire, their 75mm armor-piercing rounds screaming toward the American positions. Richter watched through his glasses as the shots fell short, striking the slope 400 meters in front of the American tanks, sending up geysers of earth but causing no damage. The maximum effective range of the Pack 40 against armored targets was 1,000 meters. Against targets at 3,200 meters, the guns might as well have been throwing stones. The American fire continued with machine-like precision. Bunker 2 took a direct hit on its roof, the shell penetrating the concrete and detonating inside. Bunker 4, actually a disguised ammunition storage point, received 3 shells in rapid succession. The third penetrated deep enough to reach the stored mortar rounds. The subsequent explosion lifted the entire bunker's roof structure and flung it 20 meters. 15 minutes into the engagement, Fort Saint-Quentin's defensive capability had been reduced by 70%. The Americans had not advanced a single meter. They had not exposed themselves to German fire. They had simply demolished prepared positions from a distance that German defensive calculations had deemed impossible. Richter's hands trembled as he raised the field glasses again, desperate to understand what weapon was destroying his command. Through the smoke and dust, he focused on the nearest American tank. The hull was standard Sherman, that low, pragmatic silhouette the Germans had learned to recognize and, in honest moments, to respect for its reliability, if not its combat power. But the turret was different, shorter. The gun tube was, "Gott I am Himmel," Richter breathed. "That's not a tank gun, that's a howitzer." The realization brought no comfort, only a sick understanding that the entire defensive strategy had been based on false assumptions. The Germans had positioned Fort Saint-Quentin's bunkers to be invulnerable, to 75mm tank guns at long range, and to slaughter advancing armor when it closed to effective firing distance. They had never considered that the Americans would mount artillery pieces on their tanks and employ them as mobile, armored gun platforms firing high-explosive shells at artillery ranges. Another shell struck the main bunker, Richter's position. The impact was catastrophic. The 33-pound M1 high-explosive shell, carrying 4.8 pounds of TNT equivalent, struck 3 meters from Richter's observation post. The reinforced concrete, designed to withstand 155mm artillery hits, cracked under the shaped explosive force concentrated at the point of impact. The ceiling above Richter's head developed a spiderweb of fractures. "Evacuate!" Richter screamed. "All positions. Fall back to secondary defenses." But there were no secondary defenses, not against this. The entire fort complex had been designed around the assumption of known threat parameters. The Americans had brought a weapon that existed outside those parameters, and German defensive doctrine had no answer. As Richter stumbled toward the bunker's rear exit, another 105mm shell struck. This one penetrated completely, entering through the observation slit and detonating inside the main chamber. The overpressure killed Hartmann instantly and flung Richter through the exit door like a rag doll. He lay in the trench behind the bunker, ears bleeding, struggling to breathe, watching the systematic destruction continue. The Americans fired with the patience of men who knew they could not be effectively engaged. They had all the time in the world, all the ammunition they needed, and they were protected by both armor and distance from any German response. Richter had fought since 1940. He had witnessed the Blitzkrieg's success, survived the Eastern Front's brutality, defended France's hedgerows. He understood combined arms warfare, tactical excellence, defensive engineering. But this was something new. The Americans had taken the concept of the assault gun and married it to their industrial philosophy. Overwhelming numbers, standardized production, unlimited ammunition, and the willingness to use any weapon in any role if it achieved results. As consciousness faded, Klaus Richter's final coherent thought was the realization that would haunt surviving German defenders for the remainder of the war. The Americans had not brought a better tank. They had brought a mobile artillery piece that looked like a tank, and German defensive calculations had become instantly, catastrophically obsolete. The impossible shot had not been impossible at all. The Germans simply never expected American ingenuity would turn the humble Sherman into a bunker-killing artillery piece that could strike from distances where defenders were helpless to respond. By the time Fort Saint-Quentin fell silent that afternoon, its defenders had learned the same lesson that would be repeated across every fortified position from Metz to the Rhine. The M4, 105, Sherman had rewritten the rules of armoured warfare, and the Germans had no answer written in their doctrine. The genesis of the M4, 105 Sherman began not in an engineering laboratory, but in the blood and sand of North Africa. During the Tunisia campaign of 1942 to 1943, American tank crews faced a brutal reality. Their 75mm guns were adequate for engaging enemy armor at medium ranges, but proved woefully inadequate when confronting German defensive positions. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces encountered a fundamental problem that would reshape armored doctrine. German defensive positions, concrete bunkers, fortified farmhouses, and dug-in anti-tank guns required heavy, high-explosive shells to neutralize. The 75mm gun on the standard M4 Sherman fired a high-explosive shell weighing just 14.6 pounds, with 1.47 pounds of explosive filler. Against earthworks and field fortifications, it was marginally effective. Against concrete and reinforced positions, it was nearly useless. American doctrine called for infantry to call in artillery support, or for towed howitzers to be brought forward to reduce fortifications. But this separated the combined arms team, slowed advances, and exposed vulnerable artillery positions to counterfire. What was needed, American observers quickly realized, was a tank that could provide its own heavy assault capability, a mobile pillbox destroyer that could keep pace with advancing armor. The solution already existed in American arsenals. The 105mm M3 howitzer, a shortened version of the M2, a one-howitzer used by towed artillery battalions, had been mounted experimentally on the M3 Lee medium tank. Though the Lee proved unsuitable for production, the concept was sound. In June 1942, the Ordnance Department authorized mounting the 105mm M3 in the M4 Sherman's turret. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The engineering challenge was substantial, but not insurmountable. The 105mm M3 howitzer was significantly larger than the 75mm M3 gun, requiring modifications to the turret and a shorter barrel to maintain balance. The final weapon measured 8 feet 11 inches in length compared to the 9 feet 7 inches of the standard 75mm gun. The turret modifications reduced ammunition stowage from 90 rounds for the 75mm to just 66 rounds for the 105mm. But this was considered acceptable given the weapon's increased destructive power per shell. The M1 high-explosive shell fired by the 105mm howitzer weighed 33 pounds and carried 4.8 pounds of TNT equivalent, more than 3 times the explosive content of the 75mm high-explosive shell. When this shell struck a concrete bunker, it delivered catastrophic results. The explosive force was sufficient to penetrate up to 4.5 inches of concrete or 18 inches of compacted earth, destroying positions that could withstand hours of 75mm fire. Production began in earnest in February 1943. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, and the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pittsburgh led manufacturing efforts. By war's end, American industry had produced 1,641 M4-105 Shermans and 841 M4, a 3-105, variants, the latter featuring the more powerful Ford GAA V8 engine. This represented approximately 6% of total Sherman production, a carefully calculated figure based on the expected ratio of assault needs to standard armor requirements. The M4-105 was distributed to separate tank battalions and to the assault gun platoons of armored divisions. Standard doctrine called for one company of 105mm Shermans per separate tank battalion, providing each infantry division with dedicated mobile assault capability. Armored divisions received one platoon of 3 M4-105 tanks per medium tank company, ensuring every armored formation had organic bunker-busting capability. What made the M4-105 revolutionary was not merely its destructive power, but its versatility. The 105mm howitzer could fire 6 different shell types: M1 high explosive for bunkers and fortifications, M67 high explosive anti-tank for engaging armor at close range, M84 smoke for obscuration, M60 white phosphorus for marking and incendiary effects, M314 illumination for night operations, and M327 propaganda shells. This flexibility meant a single vehicle could adapt to any tactical requirement. The weapon's indirect fire capability, however, remained largely unexploited in early combat. Trained primarily as tank crews rather than artillerymen, early M4-105, commanders used their weapons in direct fire mode against visible targets at ranges under 1,000 meters. This was effective but failed to leverage the weapon's true potential: artillery-style indirect fire at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. German intelligence identified the M4-105 in intelligence reports as early as November 1943. Captured technical manuals and interrogated American prisoners, confirmed the weapon's specifications. Yet, German defensive planning failed to account for how Americans would actually employ the weapon in combat. German analysis, influenced by their own assault gun doctrine, assumed the 105mm Sherman would be used like the Sturmgeschütz III in direct fire support at close ranges, accompanying infantry attacks. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1944, American tank crews, working closely with forward observers from artillery battalions, had learned to use their M4-105s as mobile howitzers. They would position hull down behind ridgelines, receive fire missions from forward observers, and engage targets using indirect fire techniques. The Sherman's gyrostabilizer, designed to stabilize the gun while moving, proved equally effective at maintaining aim during sustained firing from static positions. The Germans never adapted their defensive calculations to account for this employment method. Their bunker positioning assumed direct fire threats from tanks at 600 to 800 meters and indirect fire from towed artillery at much greater distances. The M4-105 occupied the deadly middle ground. Artillery-level destructive power combined with tank-level mobility and armor protection, engaging at ranges where German anti-tank weapons were ineffective, but with precision that towed artillery could not match. By September 1944, as American forces approached Germany's frontier fortifications, the M4-105 had evolved from an experimental assault weapon into a doctrinal necessity. Every American advance now included these bunker killers, and their crews had become expert at the devastating combination of mobility, protection, and long-range high-explosive fire that would systematically dismantle every fortified position from Metz to the Rhine. The weapon the Germans never expected had been hiding in plain sight, and their failure to understand its true employment would cost them every defensive advantage their engineering had created. Der 27. September 1944. Metz, France. General der Infanterie Hermann Balck stood in the command bunker of Fort Driant and reviewed his defensive positions with confidence bordering on certainty. Metz represented the most formidable fortress complex in Western Europe, a network of interlocking fortifications that had never fallen to direct assault in over 1,000 years of warfare. The French had built it, the Germans had improved it, and now it would demonstrate that modern firepower could not overcome 19th-century defensive engineering. The numbers supported Balck's confidence. Fort Driant alone featured walls of reinforced concrete up to 3 meters thick, designed and tested to withstand direct hits from 155mm artillery shells. The fort's 12 major bunkers provided overlapping fields of fire across every approach. Underground galleries connected the positions, allowing defenders to shift forces without exposure. Pre-registered artillery could strike any point within 4,000 meters. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, and carefully prepared firing positions for PaK-40 anti-tank guns created killing zones that American armor would have to cross under fire. The Americans will waste their strength here, Balck told his staff. Patton's Third Army may have mobility, but mobility means nothing against fortifications. They will learn what every attacker has learned. Metz does not fall. Captain Harold Griffith of the 735th Tank Battalion, commanding a platoon of M4 105 Shermans, studied the fortress through his binoculars from a position 2,800 meters west of Fort Driant. His orders were unprecedented in his experience. Establish firing positions as if preparing for an artillery mission, coordinate with forward observers from the 23rd Infantry Regiment, and engage fortified positions using indirect fire techniques. These are tanks, not howitzers, his gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, had protested during the briefing. We're trained for direct fire support. Today we're mobile artillery, Griffith had replied, studying the fire mission coordinates. The infantry can't get close enough to spot for regular artillery without getting slaughtered, but we can position behind cover, use their observers, and put 105mm shells exactly where they're needed. The technique required perfect coordination. Forward observers, hidden in shell craters and ruined buildings within 400 meters of Fort Driant, would identify targets and call corrections via radio. The M4105 crews would calculate firing solutions using artillery tables, elevate their guns to appropriate angles, and fire as self-propelled howitzers. The gyro-stabilizer system, normally used to maintain aim while moving, provided the stability needed for sustained indirect fire. At 0900 hours, the first 105mm shell arced through the September sky. The forward observer, Lieutenant Robert Chen, watched through his scope as the 33-pound projectile struck the glacis of Bunker 7, 50 meters left of the aiming point. Left 5-0, drop 2-0, he transmitted calmly. The second shell hit within 3 meters of the bunker's observation slit. The third penetrated completely, entering the firing aperture and detonating inside. Chen watched German soldiers stumbling from the emergency exits, some on fire, others simply fleeing the catastrophic overpressure that had turned their reinforced bunker into a death trap. Inside Fort Driant's command post, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber couldn't comprehend what was destroying his positions. The explosions had the signature of heavy artillery, 155mm or larger, but the rate of fire was wrong. Artillery batteries fired in concentrated barrages, multiple guns simultaneously, then paused for several minutes, while forward observers assessed damage and calculated corrections. This fire was continuous, methodical, deliberate. One shell every 12 to 15 seconds, each one more accurate than the last. "Where are the American guns?" Weber demanded, studying his maps. "Direction finding puts them northwest, approximately 2,800 meters. That's impossible. No artillery battery would position that close to our counter-battery fire." His communications officer looked up from the radio, face pale. "Herr Hauptmann," The observation post reports the fire is coming from American panzers. Sherman tanks positioned behind the western ridgeline. Absurd, Weber snapped. Sherman guns can't reach this range with accuracy. It must be artillery positioned behind the tanks. But the forward observer's report was unambiguous. Through his optics, he could clearly see the muzzle flashes from Sherman turrets. The Americans had somehow transformed their tanks into mobile howitzers, and they were systematically demolishing positions that were supposed to withstand sustained heavy artillery bombardment. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. Soldiers who had felt secure behind 3-meter concrete walls now understood those walls offered no protection. The Americans could see them, or rather, American observers could see them, and could deliver precision fire from positions the Germans couldn't even engage. Every bunker had become a marked target, every firing position a potential tomb. Over 3 days, the 735th Tank Battalion fired over 1,200 rounds of 105mm ammunition at Fort Driant. Forward observers directed fire with artillery precision, but the delivery system's mobility meant German counter-battery fire was useless. By the time German artillery calculated firing solutions, the M4-105s had displaced to new positions 400 meters away. Oberst Heinrich Hoffmann, commanding the Metz garrison's artillery, recorded his frustration in the unit war diary. "We cannot effectively engage the American assault guns. They fire from positions we cannot observe, displace before we can respond, and maintain accuracy that suggests forward observer support. Our bunkers, designed to withstand 155mm artillery, are being penetrated by weapons we were told could not threaten reinforced concrete at these ranges." The engagement statistics told the story of a defensive system rendered obsolete. Fort Driant's 12 major bunkers were reduced to 7 operational positions within 72 hours. German casualty rates in forward positions exceeded 40%, not from frontal assault, but from precision indirect fire. Soldiers began refusing to man observation posts. Those who remained did so only under threat of court-martial, knowing their positions were marked and that 105mm shells could arrive without warning. Lieutenant Chen, the forward observer, noted in his after-action report, "Enemy defenders appeared demoralized by day 2. Several positions were abandoned before we could engage them. Others flew white flags after preliminary ranging shots. The psychological effect of destroying invulnerable bunkers exceeded the physical damage. The Germans had calculated their defensive positions based on known threat parameters. When we introduced a capability outside those parameters, their entire defensive doctrine collapsed." By October 3, Fort Driant, never conquered in direct assault throughout history, was untenable. General Balck authorized withdrawal from the outer fortifications to the citadel, a retreat that acknowledged what German defensive doctrine could not accept. American ingenuity had found a way to defeat engineering with a weapon that shouldn't exist in the role it was performing. The M4-105, Sherman had done more than destroy bunkers. It had destroyed German confidence in their fortifications, and that psychological victory would echo across every defensive position from Metz to the Siegfried Line, the 12th of October, 1944, near Aachen, Germany. Oberst Gerhard Wilk surveyed the West Wall defences with the confidence of a man protected by the greatest fortification system ever constructed. The Siegfried Line, 396 miles of concrete pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking defensive positions represented the culmination of German military engineering. Here, on the threshold of the Reich itself, American advance would finally halt. The pillboxes alone guaranteed this. Each Regelbau Type 10 bunker featured 3.5-meter thick reinforced concrete walls, 2-meter thick roofs, and firing apertures designed to provide maximum defensive coverage while minimizing vulnerability. The concrete mix incorporated steel reinforcement bars and was designed to withstand direct hits from 240mm artillery shells. Mathematical calculations confirmed these positions could not be effectively engaged by tank guns at any range. Wilk had studied American tactics since Normandy. Their Sherman tanks mounted 75mm guns, effective to perhaps 800 meters against hardened positions, and even then, the shells would merely scar the concrete rather than penetrate it. The Pak-40 anti-tank guns positioned in and around the pillboxes could engage Shermans effectively out to 1,000 meters. The mathematics were simple. American tanks would have to close to ineffective range while being destroyed by German anti-tank fire. The West Wall would hold. Staff Sergeant Robert Early, of the 3rd Armoured Division's 32nd Armoured Regiment, commanded an M4105. Sherman positioned 2,400 meters from Pillbox Complex 7, a cluster of 4 interconnected bunkers controlling the approach to Aachen. His orders reflected the lessons learned at Metz: establish hull-down positions beyond German anti-tank range, coordinate with forward observers, and systematically destroy fortified positions using indirect fire. Same drill as Metz, Early briefed his crew. We're not charging the pillboxes. We're killing them from here. His gunner, Sergeant Frank DeLuca, studied the target coordinates. 2,400 meters, Sarge. That's a long shot even for indirect fire. We made it work at 2,800 meters at Fort Driant, Early replied. And these pillboxes don't have the overhead protection the forts had. High-angle fire should be even more effective. At 1,030 hours, forward observer Lieutenant William Braxton, positioned in a damaged church steeple 600 meters from the German positions, initiated the fire mission. Hotel 6, this is Overlook 2. Fire mission, bunker complex, coordinates as briefed, 4 structures, reinforced concrete, request HE with delayed fuse. The first 105 mm shell struck the roof of the northernmost pillbox. The delayed action fuse allowed the shell to penetrate before detonating, and 4.8 pounds of explosive detonated inside the concrete structure. The pillbox didn't explode, its construction was too solid for that, but smoke and dust vented from every firing slit and doorway. When the smoke cleared, Braxton could see the roof had developed massive cracks radiating from the impact point. Inside, Pillbox 7, Lieutenant Karl Baumer struggled to understand what was happening. The explosion had killed 3 of his 12 men instantly and wounded 4 more. The concussion had been catastrophic, worse than anything he'd experienced in 3 years of Eastern Front combat. Through his ringing ears, he heard his communications specialist shouting about American tanks firing from impossible ranges. "How far?" Baumer demanded. "Observation post estimates 2,400 meters. Herr Leutnant." "That's absurd. No tank gun can." The second shell struck, penetrating through the already weakened roof section. The detonation inside the confined space was murderous. Baumer found himself lying against the rear wall, his uniform smoking, his right arm numb. Around him, what remained of his garrison was either dead or staggering toward the exits in blind panic. The 105 mm Shermans of the 3rd Armoured Division worked methodically through the West Wall positions. Unlike the rapid-fire tactics German defenders expected from American armour, these weapons fired with deliberate, artillery-like precision. Forward observers would identify a pillbox, transmit coordinates, and the 105 mm crews would engage with ranging shots followed by fire for effect. Each position received between 3 and 8 shells, enough to penetrate or collapse the structures that were supposed to withstand anything short of strategic bombers. The Germans discovered another horrifying reality. Their anti-tank guns were useless. The Pak-40, effective to 1,000 meters against armor, couldn't even range the American positions at 2,400 meters. The 75 mm KOK-40 guns, mounted in the few available Panzer IVs, had even less reach, effective to perhaps 800 meters. The Americans had found the perfect standoff range close enough for accurate fire with forward observer support, far enough to be immune to German direct fire weapons. Hauptmann Werner Osterheld, commanding the 246th Volksgrenadier Division's anti-tank company, recorded his impotent fury in a letter never sent. "We sit behind our anti-tank guns, watching American panzers destroy our pillboxes from ranges we cannot engage. Our men die in bunkers that were guaranteed invulnerable. The Americans do not play by the rules we were taught. They do not charge into our killing zones. They sit beyond our reach and murder our positions with methodical precision. By October 15, the 3rd Armoured Division had destroyed or rendered untenable 27 pillboxes along a 6-kilometre front without losing a single M4105 to direct German anti-tank fire. The west wall, penetrated for the first time, had failed not because of engineering flaws, but because German defensive calculations had never accounted for American tanks employed as mobile artillery. The psychological collapse accelerated the physical destruction. German soldiers, told they were defending impregnable positions, watched those positions systematically demolished by weapons firing from beyond visual range. Surrender rates spiked. Entire pillbox garrisons would emerge with white flags after the first or second shell struck, preferring captivity to waiting for the inevitable penetrating hit. The lesson from Metz had been replicated. The M4105, Sherman, a weapon Germans knew existed but had catastrophically underestimated, had made Germany's frontier fortifications obsolete through a combination of standoff range, high explosive power, and systematic employment that German doctrine had never anticipated. The 23rd of February, 1945. Rohr River, Germany. Oberst Fritz Zangen watched the American preparations through his observation scope from the East Bank fortifications and allowed himself cautious optimism. The Ruhr, swollen by winter rains and German demolition of upstream dams, presented a formidable obstacle. His defensive positions, concrete bunkers, and reinforced observation posts commanded every metre of the opposite bank. Any American assault would require bridging under fire, a nightmare scenario that favoured defenders absolutely. "They will need smoke to obscure our observation," Zangen told his staff. But smoke dissipates. Artillery cannot maintain continuous coverage. When gaps appear, we slaughter them. At 0600 hours, the American barrage began. But this was unlike any preparatory fire Zangen had experienced. White phosphorus shells struck his forward positions with uncanny precision, not the scattered pattern of divisional artillery, but deliberate, aimed shots that struck individual bunkers and observation posts. Within minutes, a wall of white smoke obscured the entire east bank, and the smoke didn't dissipate. New shells arrived every 15 seconds, maintaining perfect obscuration. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen commanded an M4105, positioned 2,200 meters from the river. His mission was pure suppression, maintain continuous smoke coverage of German positions during the bridging operation. His crew had loaded a mixture of M84 smoke and M60 white phosphorus shells, 66 rounds, that would keep his gun firing for approximately 8 minutes before requiring resupply. "Steady rate," Chen instructed his gunner. 1 round every 12 seconds. Grid pattern across the entire East Bank complex. Don't let them see anything. The 105mm rate of fire, up to 10 rounds per minute in skilled hands, meant a single tank could maintain suppression that would normally require an entire artillery battery. And, unlike towed artillery firing from fixed positions, the M4105 could displace immediately if German counter-battery fire located it. Inside Bunker 12, Lieutenant Hans Vogel experienced the helplessness of perfect suppression. White phosphorus smoke seared into every opening, forcing his men away from observation slits. When the smoke thinned momentarily, high explosive shells would strike the bunker with precision that suggested individual targeting rather than area bombardment. His men couldn't observe, couldn't direct fire, couldn't even confirm where the American assault was developing. "Request artillery support on American tank positions," Vogel shouted into the radio. "We cannot locate them," the artillery observer replied, voice tight with frustration. "They fire, displace, fire from new positions. By the time we calculate coordinates, they've moved, and the smoke we can't observe, fall of shot to adjust." The M4105's mobility revolutionized suppression tactics. A typical fire mission involved firing 4 to 6 rounds, displacing 200 to 400 meters, resuming fire from the new position. German artillery, trained to engage static targets, found themselves shooting at positions the Shermans had vacated minutes earlier. For 40 minutes, American 105mm Shermans maintained perfect obscuration and suppression. When the smoke finally cleared, American engineers had completed 2 tactical bridges across the Ruhr, and infantry battalions were already establishing bridgeheads on the east bank. Zangen's defensive plan had collapsed without his forces firing more than sporadic, ineffective shots. Gefreiter Otto Becker, who survived the Ruhr crossing in Bunker 7, provided testimony during post-war interrogations. "We could hear the American tanks firing but could not see them. We could hear their shells landing but could not return effective fire. The smoke was continuous, deliberate, aimed. This was not artillery. Artillery creates barrage patterns. These were precision strikes by weapons that moved before we could respond. By the time the smoke cleared, the Americans were across, and we were cut off. We surrendered because defending was suicide." The psychological mathematics were devastating. German soldiers understood that occupying forward bunkers meant being blind, suppressed, and targeted by weapons they couldn't engage. Surrender rates along the Ruhr exceeded 35%, entire bunker garrisons emerging before American infantry even reached their positions. The M4105 had transformed suppression from a supporting role into a decisive tactical capability, and German defensive doctrine had no counter to mobile, protected, precision obscuration. The 8th of March 1945, Ludendorff Bridge, Remagen, Germany. The capture of the Remagen Bridge intact was Germany's nightmare, a direct route into the Reich's heart. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring ordered every available unit to destroy the bridge and crush the American bridgehead, confident that German artillery would dominate the defense. That belief collapsed within hours. Captain James Howard's platoon of M4105. Sherman's tanks, armed with 105mm howitzers, was positioned 2,800 meters from the bridge. Their mission was new: provide indirect fire support like artillery while retaining the mobility and armor of tanks. "We're the bridgehead's artillery," Howard told his men. "We'll fire like howitzers, but move like tanks." At 1,400 hours, forward observer Lieutenant Robert Walsh spotted German troops assembling in Honnef, 3,200 meters east. "Fire mission troop concentration," he radioed. Seconds later, high explosive shells rained down on Honnef's square, shattering German formations before they could advance. Hauptmann Werner Brandt, whose troops were caught in the barrage, wrote, "We thought it was divisional artillery. The fire rate was impossible, 10 rounds per minute, shifting targets instantly. We later learned it was 3 American tanks. Each M4105 fired twice as fast as a towed 105mm howitzer. 3 tanks equaled a 6-gun battery, but with armor, mobility, and near immunity to counter battery fire. German gunners east of the Rhine tried to locate the artillery, but the Shermans displaced after each mission, resuming fire from new positions before shells could land. Captured artillery officer Karl Fischer admitted, "They fought like artillery, moved like tanks. Our doctrine had no answer." Over 9 days, the M4105s fired 4,200 rounds, breaking 17 counterattacks before they reached the bridge. German artillery, once their pride, had lost its dominance. When the bridge collapsed on March 17, the American bridgehead was secure. The M4105 had redefined combined arms warfare, mobile, armoured, and devastating at range. The 2nd of April 1945, the Ruhr pocket encircled in the Ruhr industrial region, over 300,000 German troops under Field Marshal Walter Model prepared to defend cities and factories' terrain that should have favoured them. Model assumed urban combat would neutralise American armour and force slow, bloody assaults. He had not reckoned with the 105mm Shermans. Sergeant First Class Thomas Riley's M4105 supported the 8th Armoured Division in Hamm. His method was systematic: locate defended buildings, engage from standoff range, then let infantry advance unopposed. Building at grid, November 7, the Forward Observer called. 20 to 30 defenders, concrete structure. Riley's tank opened fire from 1,800 meters, 6 rounds punched through the walls, White flags appeared minutes later. The infantry advanced without casualties. Across the Ruhr, the same. Pattern unfolded. Identify, suppress, destroy. German strongpoints designed to stop infantry became death traps. Panzerfaust teams, lethal within 80 meters, were useless against tanks firing from 2,000. Division records told the story. 347 buildings engaged, 293 destroyed or silenced, 54 surrendered without a fight. Infantry casualties dropped by 70% when supported by M4105s. Captured Oberst Heinrich Voits explained the failure. Our defences were designed for 75 mm Shermans that had to approach to 600, 800 meters. The 105 mm Shermans fired from 2,000. Every strongpoint became a coffin. It was not tactics, it was the mathematics of despair. Mobility was the key. Unlike towed artillery, the M4105 could reposition instantly, firing and moving up to 4 times a day. German counter-battery fire, effective against static guns, was useless. By April 18, when Model took his own life, his fortress Ruhr had been systematically erased by mobile firepower that doctrine had never imagined. German intelligence had identified the 105 mm Sherman as early as 1943 and captured examples by 1944. They knew its capabilities, but not how it would be used. German analysts assumed it would mirror their own Stu H-42 assault guns, short-range, direct-fire support for infantry. Early combat seemed to confirm this. American crews initially used their 105 mm tanks conventionally, trained as tankers rather than artillerymen. But experience transformed doctrine. Working with forward observers, American crews realized they could deliver precise, long-range, indirect fire, combining artillery's reach with armor's protection. By autumn 1944, this had become standard practice, though German defenses still assumed Shermans had to close to short range. When the 105 mm Shermans began engaging from 2 kilometers away, those assumptions crumbled. Captured Colonel Hermann von Opperlein-Bronickowski summarized the disaster. "We knew about the weapon. We never imagined they'd use it, as mobile artillery. Every bunker, every pillbox had been placed for close-range defense. The 105 mm Shermans destroyed them from beyond reach. We built our defenses for the wrong war." By war's end, 2,482 M4105 Shermans had been built just 6% of all Shermans, but distributed across every armoured division and tank battalion. German troops encountered them everywhere. General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzerlehr later reflected, "The 105 mm Sherman was not our equal in armour or firepower, but the Americans used it with flexibility we could not match. They turned a support weapon into mobile artillery. We were bound by doctrine, they were bound only by results." That adaptability defined modern warfare. The M4105 blurred the line between tank and howitzer, direct and indirect fire, assault and support. It showed that mobility, protection, and firepower could exist in a single system, and that doctrine must evolve with technology, not constrain it. Modern systems like the M109 Paladin and Stryker MGS descend from the same principle. Armoured, mobile firepower integrated with infantry and forward observers. The weapon German intelligence understood technically but not conceptually became a model for post-war combined arms design. The Germans never imagined American tanks would destroy bunkers from 2 miles away. Their failure wasn't ignorance, it was imagination. In the final months of the war, the M4105, Sherman proved that innovation in employment can be deadlier than innovation in design. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.